Okay, hi everyone. Simon Jacobson here. Another episode of Meaningful Live. We began a biblical series taking the timeless lessons of the best-selling book of all time, the Bible, applying it to our contemporary lives. So this week we're going to be talking about the inner struggle of good versus evil. Yes, that classic story that comes up again and again, literally every second of our lives. Jacob and Esau within us, the twin brothers that is discussed in the biblical chapters that we read these weeks. This class is dedicated by Greg Renfro in honor of his son Dana Elliott's birthday. So, one thing that does not need to be elaborated upon is the conflicts of the different voices within each one of our psyches. You know, we all struggle. We all struggle between selfishness and selflessness, between taking care of our own needs and the greater good, being a giver or a taker. Literally, virtually every choice we make, is it going to be all about me or is it also going to be about someone else? Take love, that most critical component in our lives that is so necessary for everything. It could be selfish love, it could be selfless love. It challenges the very nature of who we are. Now, when you study and you look at different psychological, let's call it psychological schools of thought, you'll find one extreme to the next. If you take a more Freudian, and sometimes I call it Freudian Darwinian model, it's very much driven by the id, the self, pleasure, the pleasure principle, especially in the area of sexuality. Survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, which shouldn't be confused with Darwinism per se, is the survival of the fittest. Richard Dawkins, in his classic book, the very title tells it to you all. All you need to know. The selfish gene, that the very gene, we're not talking about choices, the very nature of the beast, the very nature of everything in existence, is perpetuation of self. And that explains the competition for breeding that you find in all species, not just animal and human, but also even in the plant kingdom. And everywhere, the need to perpetuate the species. And it makes sense, because if you don't perpetuate yourself, everything else falls to the wayside. There is a question that needs to be addressed, and perhaps now is not the time. Why is that indeed the case? Why couldn't we have the selfless gene, where we're driven to be selfless? Why does it have to be selfish? But it makes sense because all of us know, I want to exist. I want to survive. And I will do whatever it takes, even if it means taking away something from another. So we are fundamentally competing for resources, competing for perpetuation, competing for survival, which is the dog eats dog. Now, we can create a civil community because in the name of existence and coexistence, even in Freudian psychology, there is the concept of the ego and the superego that impose themselves to be like a referee to keep order. You need red lights and green lights. But that's also part of survival, because if not, we'd all kill each other, and that's also not good for the individual selfish gene. But fundamentally, the selfishness of the person is what drives you. And yet, we also find another voice inside of us, that's the noble voice, the transcendent voice. That's not all about me. Look at the sacrifices that mothers and fathers make for their children, sacrifices that people make for each other, loved ones, and also for strangers at times. So it's not a given that in every situation, a person is going to first choose themselves over others. That's not the case. Now, how is that explained? So the Darwinian model or the Freudian model will often say that too is part of self-interest. They explain everything. Even that is selfish. Because you die as a martyr, you'll be remembered. And that itself is what we convince ourselves is a virtue and a quality. I am not as cynical and skeptical that I can be. I like to reserve some things that not every noble act is dismissed yet another biological act of selfishness. You know, you want to believe, and I have no absolute proof for it, But you want to believe that the kindness and the virtue, and I read about or meet people, a mother who spends her whole life to try to connect with her autistic child. And when we cry for tragedies that happen in our lives, and also for joys, that it's not all a biologically wired chemical reaction. Call me a romantic, a suffering romantic, as you see fit. I don't know that you can prove one way or the other. But one thing is for sure. We have these voices within us, and all of us have them. We have the noble voice, I'll call it the selfless one, the transcendent one, and we have the selfish voice, the one that takes, that wants, and demands. And yes, people can go to the worst extremes. We've seen the worst things, how human beings have perpetrated injustice, one-on-one, on nations, on peoples. I mean, you see it till this very day. Thank God it's much less today than it once used to be. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about mass rape, the pillaging, simply because others are not the way you think, that others are different than you, and you're the one that feels superior. Or because you're in control and power, so you can do it. And then we've also seen the heights of sensitivity that a human being is capable of. So look inside yourself. Which one are you? Well, it's hard, no one should ever be tested, but it's hard to imagine if you were really tortured in a scenario, nobody's watching you, and no one knows, you're tortured, you're desperate, you're dying from hunger. Would you turn to cannibalism? Would you turn on your own loved ones or strangers in order to save your own skin? As we know in history, some have and some haven't. We'd like to believe we wouldn't, but there's already plenty of documented stories about how people turn to cannibalism literally because when they're dying from and desperate in hunger. But we all have the two voices. So which one is it? Which dominates? And what is going on? So this story, the biblical story of the famous twins, the twins called Esau and Jacob, or in Hebrew, Esau and Jacob, which is the story of Abraham having a son called Isaac, Isaac having with Rebekah, his wife, these twin children. And the Bible tells us that in the very womb of their mother Rebekah, or Rivkah, they were already struggling. She was having a difficult pregnancy. And when she turns to God, God says, because you're carrying two nations within you. Two nations. You don't hear that every day. Two nations, two archetypes. And these archetypes, they're twins. They're twin brothers. So they're equal in every possible way, and yet they go in two different directions as the story unfolds. One, and this is how they're named. One is called the innocent, the simple, the sincere, the man of integrity, the dweller of tents, the scholar. And the other is called the warrior. The warrior, the hunter, a master at hunting, at battle. And these are the two twins that are born, and they're very different. And they are in perpetual battle with each other and conflict with each other from even their pregnancy and throughout their lifetimes. Without going into all the details, what is these two archetypes? What does it mean, two nations, two voices? Well, just look again inside yourself. These are the two voices. This is the root. Long before Freud, and long before Jung, and long before Adler, and long before Viktor Frankl, and all the different schools of psychology, whether they focused on the savage within us or they focused on the angel within us, these two voices are told to us thousands of years ago. These are the two voices within you right now. And one is a warrior and a hunter, and it should be, because we live in a hostile world. We live in a world where you need protection, and we need to tame the elements, and many times we need that aggressive side, or else we'll be hurt. However, that shouldn't define who you are. That's a necessity. And then there's another voice, another archetype, another personality within our psyches. And that is the one of integrity, that seeks seamlessness, that seeks giving virtue. And you need both. You need both. Remember reading about a porcupine. a porcupine has the sharpest needles, but the softest underbelly. It has to have those needles to protect itself. So often when I see people who are very aggressive and very demanding and very dominating and domineering, I sometimes wonder, maybe it's just a soft underbelly that they're trying to protect. They don't want to be hurt. However, you don't want to become the needles. You want to use them and need them. You want to use them and access them when there's a need, when there's danger. You want to be the soft soul within. We grow up as children. All of us have an element of seamlessness. A child, what you see is what you get. You don't have duplicity yet. You don't have lying. Children learn that from adults, from their parents, from others. But on the other hand, a child living in this world, the world is sometimes a very difficult world. And like parents will tell children, you can't always say what you feel. People will take advantage of you. And then often we lose our innocence. And what happens is we become the warrior. You live a life of war, of battle, at work, in the streets, even in relationships and romance. That's not always a battle, but there's always that competition, that who's going to dominate, who's going to win. We go out to conquer, conquests. They're sometimes very, very beautiful, but they can also turn vicious. Right? You see people in the name of love, what they can end up doing, in the name of their own needs, what they end up doing, terrible things to each other. Even people who claim to love each other or once loved each other. So it's a complex story, but it comes down to the narrative of these two twins. And the interesting is that they're equals. I don't know if you ever saw this. I don't know if you're one of the Trekkies. That's that episode in Star Trek where Captain Kirk, some gamma ray or radiation causes a split in his personality, where his aggressive side and his gentle side separate into two. And you see a study of a type of doctor, like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where it's never meant to be. No one should ever see themselves so isolated, where you isolate the good and the bad, because they both need each other. Because there really isn't good and evil per se. You need the aggressive part for certain situations, but you need the reflective part to be able to be objective, to be fair and just. So if you only have the aggressive side, it could also be very selfish, very savage. If you only have the reflective side, you can be lacking passion and lacking that energy, that zest, that drive. So in truth is we need both, and they need to be harnessed in a proper way, which is really the inside story, again, of these two brothers. That it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's not one wins or one loses. You need each other, which is indeed the very deeper meaning of the story with the blessings and the firstborn. It wasn't that one brother was trying to take away from the other. It was a process of harnessing that ultimately, how can we maximize and have the best of both worlds? The warrior and the drive and that passion that a warrior has, while also having the objectivity, the seasoning, the reflection, the maturity of the scholar. That is the challenge. So the first thing we need to know is that these two voices, there's nothing wrong with that. It's exactly the way it was meant to be. We are born, and it's innate within us. In the womb, we already have these two voices, these two personalities. We need to understand that they're both necessary, but they both need to listen to each other. Think of a person that has a mind and no emotions, or a person with emotions and no mind. The mind provides reflection, provides balance, objectivity. You don't just jump at every impulse. The emotions provide the very blood, the very marrow of a passionate and personally subjective life. What would a human being like a mind? Like a computer. Yeah, everything is rational, everything is calculated, everything is researched, everything is reviewed, and you make sure it's correct on all levels, but you're lacking that emotional, that spontaneity, if you wish, that a sense of adventure and free abandon that only comes with an emotional life. On the other hand, emotions without a mind have no direction, are misguided. Think of a ship without a captain. A captain without a ship is going nowhere, even though He may have the mind, he may have that part, that voice, but a captain with a ship without a captain doesn't know where to go. So we really need both a real balance of a mind that is there not to stifle or in any way repress emotional expression, but a mind that guides it, that directs it like a captain of a ship. On the other hand, the key is to have the ship. The key is to have the experience. How many of us hide behind our minds because we're afraid to be vulnerable? We're afraid to experience love because then we can be hurt. When you love someone, you can also be hurt by them. So we'd like to have control, but it doesn't work that way. If you want to, so we put up all kinds of layers of armor. And yes, we can manifest, and someone's smart, they can masquerade as if they're emotional when they're really not. So really what we're looking for is the balance between the two. Not to be overly cerebral and not to be overly emotional. When I say an overly emotional, I don't mean it in the way that not to have many emotions, but I mean to say not to allow emotions to completely control everything. And that's the balance, and that's the two brothers, the twins, in every way equal, but the forces, the directions, the voices. One is focusing, what's the higher purpose? The Jacob within us. The other is, how do I implement it in a world where there's hostility, where there's corruption, where there is duplicity, where there are people who want to take advantage. And always maintain both the balance, because you don't want to become a warrior. You want to use it when needed, but that doesn't define and identify you. So it's a matter of finding balance in every part of our lives, that we are in the marketplace, or you can say when we're swimming with the sharks, where we may need to have some aggressive tools. Never lose sight of your more gentle side of your personality. Have ways to remember it, whether it's having a charity box in your office desk, whether it's having your team do something once a week to volunteer, something of kindness that doesn't necessarily generate profit per se in the company. In generally creating a climate of kindness, of love and giving, while also being very fiercely competitive, ethical obviously, but yes, we're not talking about just giving in. On the other hand, when you are at home and when you're in the environment where you're more of the Jacob-like gentleness, you also need to know there are standards, there's discipline. So sometimes we can look at it like in the context of having the balance between compassion and discipline. And that is the ultimate balance that we are achieving. When you have that, you're able to navigate properly. The gas and the brakes, knowing how to bring the two together. I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but the first thing is identify and be at peace with the fact that there are two voices. And they're going to conflict with each other. But know there's something deeper beneath them all, that they both can be harnessed toward one higher purpose, because that higher purpose is what put them both in place in the first place. They didn't begin as adversarial forces. They began as twins coming from the same mother and the same father. But then there are two different faculties or two different dispositions and approaches to life. So at the end of the day, we need to have the warrior, but we need to be the gentle soul that uses the warrior when necessary to achieve the goals, again, the goals that are of higher purpose. Like Hillel said it well. We're not saying be a doormat and forget about the self. Talk about selfish gene. Yes, there's a need to protect yourself. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And then comes the second statement, however. If I'm only for myself, what am I? So it's, again, the harmony between individuality and the collective, just as it is in the human body, in nature itself. You have unbelievable diversity and multitudes of species, each one in their own way, but they all work together in one harmony, one symphony. And finally, in the third statement, as Hillel says, and if not now, when? Now is the time, my friends, to bring these voices, to recognize them, bring them together into one glorious union where we do have music of all extremes, and yet they're all working toward one higher end. And that higher end is a cause that's greater than each one of us, and yet we are all indispensable components in it, is indeed to create music in this world, to bring love, light, warmth, and discover that harmony within diversity. That is the key to all happiness. The ability to recognize that we are all components 8 billion of us and counting, of one larger symphony, each one playing our song and our music. May you be blessed to be able to balance the Esau and Jacob within you and have the qualities of each when necessary, and always consult with a mentor, with a friend, to make sure you're on course and not deceiving yourself, because we all have that blind spot that sometimes doesn't allow us to see clearly. And with that, I'd like to sign off. Just for now, please stay in touch. Please share. I'd love to hear your comments. This has been Simon Jacobson, Meaningful Life Center, meaningfullife.com. And it's always an honor. And thank you for giving me your time. And together we can achieve much more than the sum of the parts, the synergy. Be well. Bye.